The early morning sun had barely risen when Marcus Johnson opened his eyes. The abandoned building where he lived with his grandmother was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic starting to build on Chicago's busy streets. At 12 years old, Marcus was already familiar with the weight of adult responsibilities that sat heavily on his young shoulders. The room they called home was small, but his grandmother had done her best to make it livable. Old blankets covered the windows to keep out the cold, and their few belongings were neatly arranged in cardboard boxes. In the corner, his grandmother slept peacefully on a worn mattress they had found last month behind a furniture store. Marcus moved quietly, not wanting to wake her. She needed all the rest she could get. Her arthritis had been getting worse, and the cold weather didn't help. He grabbed his backpack, a second-hand gift from a church donation drive, and checked inside to make sure his school books were still dry. The roof had been leaking again last night. Looking in a cracked mirror propped against the wall, Marcus straightened his clothes. His t-shirt was clean but faded, and his jeans were a little too short now that he had grown taller. But his grandmother had taught him that being poor didn't mean being untidy. Every evening, she washed their clothes by hand in a bucket of water they collected from a nearby park fountain. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," she always said, and Marcus took these words to heart. Before leaving, he checked their food supply hidden in an old cooler. There was just enough bread for his grandmother's breakfast, but nothing for lunch. He would have to figure something out later. Marcus was good at finding food. He knew which restaurants threw away good leftovers and which grocery stores sometimes gave away day-old bread. His grandmother stirred slightly, and Marcus went to her side. "Good morning, Grandma," he whispered, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. "Morning, baby," she said softly, her eyes still closed. "Did you do your homework?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. He had stayed up late working on his math problems by candlelight. His teacher, Ms. Thompson, had praised his improving grades last week, and he didn't want to disappoint her. "That's my smart boy," his grandmother murmured. "Don't forget your prayers." Marcus bowed his head for a moment, just as his grandmother had taught him. He prayed for their safety, for a better home, and most importantly, for his grandmother's health. Then he kissed her forehead and headed for the door. The stairs of the abandoned building creaked under his feet as he made his way down. He had memorized which steps to skip to avoid making noise. There were other homeless people living in the building, and some didn't like being disturbed early in the morning. Outside, the city was waking up. Business people hurried past with coffee cups in their hands, barely noticing the young boy among them. Marcus walked with purpose, keeping his head high just like his grandmother taught him. "You're not less than anybody," she always said. "You're just going through a rough patch, but education is your ticket out." The walk to school took 30 minutes, but Marcus didn't mind. He used this time to practice his multiplication tables in his head and sometimes made up stories about the people he passed. The coffee shop lady who sometimes gave him free hot chocolate was a secret superhero in his imagination. The old man who fed pigeons in the park was actually a wizard in disguise. At school, Marcus transformed into just another student. Nobody knew he was homeless. He made sure of that. He arrived early enough to wash up in the bathroom and fix his appearance. His teachers saw a quiet, hard-working boy who always turned in his homework on time. His classmates knew him as the kid who was good at math and always had interesting stories to tell. As he sat down at his desk that morning, Marcus felt the familiar gnaw of hunger in his stomach, but he ignored it. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Your education is the one thing nobody can take away from you." He opened his textbook and focused on the lesson, determined to make her proud, despite the challenges that lay ahead for another day. The sky was turning dark as Marcus made his way through the back alleys behind the restaurants. This was his usual route home from school, and he knew exactly which dumpsters might have good food that hadn't spoiled. His stomach had been growling all day. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's school lunch. The air was filled with the smell of fried food from Ming's Chinese restaurant. Marcus remembered when his grandmother used to work there as a dishwasher before her arthritis got too bad. Sometimes, the cook would give them leftover egg rolls at closing time. But that was 2 years ago, before they lost their apartment. He carefully lifted the lid of the first dumpster, trying not to make noise. Restaurant workers didn't like it when they caught kids looking for food, even though they threw away so much of it. Inside, he found some half-eaten containers of rice and a mostly whole hamburger wrapped in foil. It wasn't much, but it would help fill their empty stomachs tonight. As Marcus put the food in his backpack, a sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, a weak whimper coming from behind a stack of cardboard boxes. Something about that sound made his heart beat faster. It reminded him of pain and fear, feelings he knew too well from his own hard life. "Hello," he called softly, moving closer to the boxes. "Is someone there?" The whimpering got a little louder. Marcus pushed aside some wet cardboard and gasped at what he saw. A large golden retriever lay on its side, breathing heavily. Its golden fur was dirty and matted with blood, and one of its legs was bent at a strange angle. The dog's eyes were half closed, but Marcus could see they were filled with pain. "Oh no," Marcus whispered, kneeling beside the injured animal. "What happened to you, buddy?" Looking closer, he could see tire marks on the ground and broken glass nearby. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. The dog must have been hit by a car and dragged itself into this alley to hide. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest. How could someone hit a dog and just drive away? The dog tried to lift its head when Marcus reached out, but it was too weak. Its tail made the tiniest movement, like it was trying to wag, but didn't have the strength. This small sign of trust, despite its pain, brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Without hesitation, Marcus took off his worn jacket and gently laid it over the shivering dog. Then he remembered the hamburger in his backpack. His own stomach protested as he unwrapped it, but he knew the dog needed it more than he did. "Here," he said softly, breaking the burger into small pieces. "You need to eat to get strong again." The dog sniffed weakly at the food. After a moment, it managed to eat a few small bites. Marcus felt a surge of hope when he saw this. If the dog could eat, maybe it could survive. "I'll call you Hope," Marcus said, gently stroking the dog's head. "Because we can't give up hope, right? My grandma always says that." As the evening grew colder, Marcus knew he had to make a decision. His grandmother would be worried if he didn't come home soon. But looking at Hope's injured body and trusting eyes, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the dog alone to die in this cold, dark alley. Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket, an old model his grandmother insisted he keep for emergencies, with just enough minutes for important calls. This felt like an emergency. He quickly dialed home. "Grandma," he said when she answered, his voice trembling slightly. "I found a hurt dog. It's really bad. I can't leave it here alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then his grandmother's warm voice came through. "You do what your heart tells you is right, baby. Just be careful and try to stay warm." Marcus looked down at Hope, who had moved slightly closer to him, seeking warmth. "I'll stay with you tonight," he promised the dog. "You're not alone anymore." As night fell over the city, Marcus settled in beside Hope, sharing his body heat with the injured animal. He might be hungry, and tomorrow at school might be tough without much sleep, but he knew in his heart he was doing the right thing. Sometimes, he thought, being poor in money didn't mean you had to be poor in kindness. The night grew colder as Marcus sat in the alley with Hope. The sounds of the city changed, fewer cars passed by, and the restaurant kitchens had gone quiet. Only the occasional siren in the distance broke the silence. Marcus pulled his school blanket from his backpack, the one he kept for cold days during lunch break, and carefully covered Hope with it. "You're shaking less now," he whispered to the injured dog. "That's good." Marcus had arranged some cardboard boxes to block the wind, creating a small shelter around them. He remembered how his grandmother had taught him to do this during their first weeks of being homeless, before they found the abandoned building. Sometimes, she had said, you have to make a home wherever you are. Every few minutes, Hope would whimper in pain, and Marcus's heart would break a little more. He had found some old newspapers in a recycling bin and used them to clean the blood from Hope's fur as gently as he could. The dog's golden coat was still dirty, but at least now Marcus could see where the injuries were worst. "I wish I had some medicine for you," Marcus said softly, stroking Hope's head. "But I have water. You must be thirsty." He took out his water bottle from school, the one he usually saved to last all day. Cupping his hand, he poured a little water into it and held it near Hope's mouth. The dog lapped weakly at first, then with more energy. Marcus smiled. It was another good sign. Around midnight, it started to rain. Light drops at first, then heavier. Marcus looked at his school books in his backpack, knowing they might get wet, but he didn't move the blanket from Hope. Books could dry, but Hope needed the warmth more. Instead, he used his body to shield the dog from the rain, getting soaked himself in the process. "My friend Kevin has a dog," Marcus told Hope, trying to distract himself from the cold. "A little terrier named Max. Maybe when you're better, you can meet him. Kevin's mom might know how to help you too." He kept talking, remembering how his grandmother always said that friendly voices could heal better than medicine sometimes. Hope's breathing had become more regular now, though the injured leg still looked bad. Every now and then, the dog would try to move closer to Marcus, seeking comfort. It amazed Marcus how an animal that had been hurt so badly by humans still trusted him enough to accept his help. As the night went on, Marcus fought to stay awake. He was wet, cold, and hungry, but he kept checking on Hope's breathing and making sure the blanket stayed in place. He thought about his grandmother, probably worried sick despite giving him permission to stay. He thought about tomorrow at school, how he'd have to try to stay awake during lessons. But looking at Hope's trusting eyes, he knew he'd make the same choice again. Around 3 in the morning, something remarkable happened. Hope lifted his head slightly and licked Marcus's hand. It was a small gesture, but it filled Marcus's heart with joy. "You're getting stronger," he said, smiling through his exhaustion. "We just have to make it until morning. Then we'll figure something out." To pass the time, Marcus told Hope stories about his life, about his grandmother's amazing cooking before they became homeless, about his dreams of becoming a veterinarian someday, about the kind lunch lady at school who sometimes gave him extra food without asking questions. Hope listened, ears twitching occasionally at the sound of Marcus's voice. The rain eventually stopped, but the cold remained. Marcus wrung out his wet clothes as best he could while staying close to Hope. His teeth chattered, but he kept talking, kept watching, kept caring. This was the first time since becoming homeless that he felt truly needed by someone other than his grandmother. It was a different feeling. Scary but good at the same time. As the sky began to show the first hints of dawn, Marcus saw Hope's tail wag slightly. It wasn't much, but it was like a tiny message of thanks. "We did it," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from talking all night. "We made it through the dark together." The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to paint the sky when Dr. Sarah Chen pulled into the parking lot behind her veterinary clinic. She always arrived early on Wednesdays to catch up on paperwork before the busy day began. But this morning would be different from any other in her 15 years as a vet. As she stepped out of her car, carrying her coffee and briefcase, she heard what sounded like someone talking softly. The voice seemed to be coming from the alley next to her clinic. Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment. Early morning encounters in city alleys weren't always safe, but something about the gentle tone of the voice made her curious. "Just a little longer," she heard as she moved closer. "The sun's coming up now. That means it's getting warmer." Peering around the corner, Dr. Chen saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A young black boy, probably no more than 12 or 13, was sitting on the ground next to what appeared to be an injured golden retriever. The boy was soaking wet, shivering, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. But it was the tenderness with which he stroked the dog's fur that caught her attention. "Hello there," Dr. Chen called softly, not wanting to startle them. "Is everything okay?" Marcus jumped slightly at the voice, immediately protective of Hope. He'd heard stories about people who pretended to help but really wanted to cause trouble. But when he saw the woman's white medical coat and the name of the veterinary clinic on it, his heart leaped with hope. "Pleased," he said, his voice rough from talking all night. "Can you help my dog? He got hit by a car. I've been with him all night, trying to keep him warm." Dr. Chen knelt down beside them, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. The dog was seriously injured but alive, and from the looks of things, it was largely thanks to this boy's care through the night. "You kept him alive," she said softly. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he replied, then quickly added, "I don't have any money, but I can work. I can clean your clinic or help with the animals. Anything. Just please help Hope." The vet noticed how Marcus's clothes were worn and damp, how his backpack looked stuffed with what seemed to be all his possessions. She saw the school books peeking out, and the way he tried to sit up straight despite his obvious exhaustion. But most importantly, she saw the love and worry in his eyes as he looked at the dog. "Let's get you both inside," Dr. Chen said, already reaching for her clinic keys. Hope is a perfect name for this brave dog, by the way. With great care, they managed to move Hope onto a blanket that Dr. Chen brought from her car. Marcus insisted on helping carry one end of the blanket, even though he was barely staying on his feet from exhaustion. Inside the warm clinic, Dr. Chen quickly got to work, checking Hope's vital signs and assessing his injuries. "You did an amazing job keeping him stable," she told Marcus, who refused to leave Hope's side. "The leg is broken, and there are some cuts that need stitching, but I don't see any internal injuries. He's going to need surgery, but I think he's going to make it." Tears of relief filled Marcus's eyes. "Really?" he whispered, his hand still gentle on Hope's head. As Dr. Chen prepared for the surgery, she made Marcus drink some hot chocolate from the clinic's break room and wrap himself in a warm blanket. While she worked, she kept thinking about this young boy who had given everything he had, his warmth, his comfort, his only blanket and food, to save a stranger's dog. Making a decision, she stepped into her office and made 2 phone calls, one to her friend at the local news station and another to the mayor's office. A story like this needed to be told. A heart like Marcus's needed to be recognized. While Hope was in surgery, Dr. Chen took a few photos of Marcus sleeping in the waiting room, curled up in the warm blanket she had given him. She typed a quick post on her social media account. "This young hero spent all night in the rain saving an injured dog. No money, no shelter, but a heart bigger than this whole city." By the time Marcus woke up 2 hours later, his story had already begun to spread across Chicago like wildfire. Dr. Chen's post had been shared thousands of times, and local news stations were calling the clinic nonstop. But Marcus knew nothing about this as he rubbed his eyes and immediately asked about Hope. "The surgery went perfectly," Dr. Chen told him with a smile. "Hope is resting now. Would you like to see him?" Marcus nodded eagerly, following her to the recovery room. Hope was sleeping peacefully, his leg in a cast, his wounds cleaned and bandaged. The dirty golden fur had been gently washed, revealing its true beautiful color. When Hope heard Marcus's footsteps, his tail started wagging weakly. "He remembers me," Marcus whispered, his eyes shining with joy. Meanwhile, across the city, people were deeply moved by the story. Sarah Martinez, a reporter from Channel 5 News, was the first to arrive at the clinic. She found Marcus sitting beside Hope's bed, sharing his school lunch with the dog. "Marcus," Dr. Chen said gently, "this nice lady would like to talk to you about how you saved Hope. Would that be okay?" Marcus looked nervous. He hadn't told anyone at school about being homeless, and now it might be on TV. But then he looked at Hope and remembered something his grandmother always said. "Sometimes God puts you in difficult situations so you can help others." Maybe his story could help other homeless kids and animals. "Okay," he said quietly, "but can I stay next to Hope while we talk?" The interview was simple and honest. Marcus told Sarah about finding Hope in the alley, about staying with him all night in the rain, and about Dr. Chen's kindness. What he didn't realize was that his words were touching hearts across the city. By afternoon, the story had reached every major news outlet in Chicago. "Homeless Boy's Act of Kindness Shines Light on Youth Homelessness," read one headline. "Young Hero Sacrifices Everything to Save Dying Dog," said another. People began calling the clinic, asking how they could help both Marcus and Hope. Marcus's school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, saw him on the news and finally understood why this bright student sometimes seemed so tired in class. She immediately called a staff meeting to discuss how they could better support students in similar situations. At the local coffee shop where Marcus sometimes got free hot chocolate, the owner, Mr. Wilson, watched the news with tears in his eyes. He had never known the polite young boy who came to his shop was homeless. He immediately called the news station to offer Marcus's grandmother a job in his cafe. Throughout the day, more people arrived at the clinic. A local restaurant owner brought hot meals for Marcus and promised to provide dinner for him and his grandmother every night. A clothing store owner came with new warm clothes and shoes. Each person who heard the story wanted to help in some way. But Marcus remained focused on Hope. When people tried to talk to him about his kindness, he just shrugged and said, anyone would do the same. He didn't see himself as special, he was just doing what his grandmother had taught him about helping others in need. By evening, Dr. Chen's original social media post had reached the mayor's office. The mayor, deeply moved by Marcus's compassion and the community's response, began making plans. This story had revealed both the best of human nature and the urgent need to address youth homelessness in their city. As the sun set, Marcus sat beside Hope, unaware that his simple act of kindness had sparked a movement that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others in Chicago. The next morning, Marcus arrived at school feeling nervous. He had barely slept after spending most of the previous day at the veterinary clinic with Hope. Dr. Chen had insisted he go home to his grandmother and get some rest, promising to take good care of Hope through the night. Still, leaving the dog had been hard. As he walked through the school hallways, Marcus noticed something different. Students and teachers were looking at him, some smiling, others whispering to each other. His heart beat faster. Had they seen the news? Did they now know he was homeless? He kept his head down and hurried to his first class, trying to be invisible. "Marcus Johnson, please come to the principal's office." The announcement crackled over the school speakers during his math class. His classmates all turned to look at him, and Marcus felt his face grow hot. He had never been called to the principal's office before. As he walked down the quiet hallway, Marcus thought about all the possibilities. Maybe someone had complained about him washing up in the school bathroom every morning. Maybe they were going to make him leave the school because they found out he didn't really live in the district anymore. But when he opened the door to the principal's office, he found Mrs. Rodriguez smiling warmly at him. Next to her stood a tall woman in a business suit, holding a fancy-looking envelope. "Marcus, please come in," Mrs. Rodriguez said kindly. "This is Ms. Thompson from the mayor's office. She has something special for you." Marcus's hands were shaking slightly as he sat down. The last time he had seen someone in a business suit, it had been the landlord telling them they had to leave their apartment. But Miss Thompson's smile was friendly as she held out the envelope. "Marcus," she said, "Mayor Anderson has heard about your incredible kindness in saving Hope. He would like to invite you and your grandmother to City Hall this afternoon for a special meeting." Marcus stared at the envelope in his hands. It had gold letters on it and felt heavy and expensive. "But I have classes," he said quietly, still thinking about his grandmother's words about education being most important. Mrs. Rodriguez laughed gently. "Marcus, we're giving you special permission to miss your afternoon classes. This is a very important invitation." Miss Thompson nodded in agreement. "We've arranged for a car to pick you up from school at lunchtime. The car will then get your grandmother and bring you both to City Hall. The mayor is very excited to meet you." Marcus felt overwhelmed. He had spent so long trying to hide their situation, trying to blend in, and now suddenly everyone knew. But something about Ms. Thompson's kind eyes made him feel a little less scared. Can I ask something?" Marcus said hesitantly. Both women nodded encouragingly. "Would it be possible to stop at the veterinary clinic on the way? I promised Hope I'd visit him today." Miss Thompson's eyes softened. "Of course," she said. "In fact, Dr. Chen is already part of the plan." As Marcus walked back to his class, holding the fancy invitation carefully, his mind was spinning with questions. What did the mayor want? Why was Dr. Chen involved? Would people treat him differently now that they knew he was homeless? In class, his friend Kevin leaned over and whispered, "I saw you on the news last night. What you did for that dog was really cool." Marcus expected to see pity in his friend's eyes, but instead he saw admiration. Maybe, he thought, his grandmother was right about another thing she always said: your character matters more than your circumstances. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Marcus tried to focus on his lessons, but his thoughts kept drifting between Hope at the clinic and the mysterious invitation in his backpack. When lunchtime finally came, he found a sleek black car waiting outside the school, just as Miss Thompson had promised. As he got into the car, Marcus held the invitation tightly. Whatever was going to happen at City Hall, he just hoped it would somehow help him keep his promise to Hope, to give the dog a better life than the one they had found him in. The black car pulled up in front of Chicago's City Hall, an impressive building that made Marcus feel very small. His grandmother sat beside him, wearing her best dress, the one she saved for church. She held his hand tightly as they walked up the stone steps together. Inside, the building was even more impressive. The floors were shiny marble, and important-looking people hurried back and forth. Miss Thompson met them in the lobby, her face bright with excitement. "The mayor is ready to see you now," she said, leading them toward a large elevator. Marcus's heart was beating fast. He had already visited Hope at the clinic on the way here. The dog had been so happy to see him, wagging his tail and trying to lick his face. Dr. Chen had come along too, but she wouldn't tell Marcus why she was heading to City Hall. She just smiled and said it was a surprise. The elevator took them to the top floor, where two large wooden doors opened into the mayor's office. Mayor Anderson, a tall man with kind eyes and gray hair, stood up from behind his desk when they entered, but what made Marcus gasp was who else was in the room. Dr. Chen was there, and beside her, lying on a soft bed that had been set up specially, was Hope. The dog's tail started wagging wildly when he saw Marcus. There were other people too. News reporters with cameras, some business people Marcus didn't recognize, and even his school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez. "Marcus Johnson," Mayor Anderson said, walking over to shake his hand. "You've shown our city what true compassion looks like." Marcus stood straighter, just like his grandmother had taught him, even though his legs felt shaky. The mayor led them to some comfortable chairs, and everyone gathered around. "Marcus," the mayor began, "your kindness to Hope has touched many hearts. But it has also opened our eyes to a serious problem in our city, youth homelessness. Today, we're going to change that, starting with you and your grandmother." He nodded to one of the business people, who stepped forward. "I'm John Martinez from Lakeside Apartments," the man said. "We want to offer you and your grandmother a 2-bedroom apartment, rent-free for the first year. After that, the rent will be set at a rate your grandmother can afford with her new job." Marcus's grandmother squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "New job?" she asked softly. Another person stepped forward, the owner of the coffee shop where Marcus sometimes got free hot chocolate. "Yes, ma'am. I need someone to manage my new bakery section. The hours are flexible, and will work around your arthritis." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing, but there was more. Dr. Chen spoke next. "Hope is fully recovered, and he needs a home. Marcus, would you and your grandmother like to adopt him? I'm also offering you a part-time job at the clinic after school. You have a natural gift with animals." The mayor then announced the biggest surprise of all. "Inspired by Marcus's story, we're launching a new city program to help homeless youth and their families. We're calling it the Hope Initiative. It will provide housing, job training, and support services to families in need." Tears were flowing freely now, not just from Marcus and his grandmother, but from many others in the room. Hope managed to limp over to Marcus, resting his head on the boy's lap. "I don't know what to say," Marcus whispered, looking at all the faces around him. His grandmother spoke up, her voice strong despite her tears. "My grandson has always been special. Even when we had nothing, he never stopped caring about others." The mayor smiled. "That's exactly why we're here today. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness." As the reporters took pictures and people began discussing details of the new program, Marcus sat quietly petting Hope. Just a few days ago, he had been trying to survive in an abandoned building. Now, because he had stopped to help an injured dog, everything was changing. "See," his grandmother whispered to him, "God works in mysterious ways." Marcus looked around the room, at Hope, at Dr. Chen, at the mayor, and at all the people who had come together to help them. Maybe his grandmother was right. Maybe sometimes you've had to go through hard times to find your way to better ones. 2 months had passed since that life-changing day at City Hall. Marcus stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his new school uniform. The morning sunlight streamed through clean windows, and from the kitchen came the smell of his grandmother's cooking, something he hadn't experienced in years. Their new apartment was on the 3rd floor of Lakeside Apartments, with 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and even a small balcony. But the best part was Hope's bed in the corner of Marcus's room, where the golden retriever now slept peacefully, his leg fully healed. "Marcus, breakfast is ready," his grandmother called. Her voice was stronger these days. Working at the coffee shop bakery had brought back her joy for cooking, and her arthritis was better managed now that she had proper medical care. As Marcus entered the kitchen, Hope limping happily behind him, he saw his grandmother placing pancakes on the table. She wore her baker's apron. She had to leave for work in an hour. The sight of her standing in a real kitchen, cooking in their own home, still felt like a dream sometimes. "Don't forget you have your shift at the clinic after school today," she reminded him, setting down Hope's food bowl. Dr. Chen had kept her promise about the part-time job, and Marcus spent 3 afternoons a week helping care for the animals. He was learning so much about veterinary medicine, and his dream of becoming a vet felt more possible with each passing day. At school, things were different too. Marcus no longer had to hide his situation. Instead, he had become something of a leader. With the principal's support, he had started a student group called Hope Helpers that collected food, clothes, and supplies for homeless students and their families. "You know what today is?" his grandmother asked as they ate breakfast. Marcus nodded. "The mayor is announcing the expansion of the Hope Initiative. The program that had started because of his story had already helped 20 homeless families find housing and jobs. Today, it would expand to include more neighborhoods and resources." After breakfast, Marcus grabbed his backpack, a new one, though he had kept his old one as a reminder of where he came from. Hope followed him to the door, tail wagging. Before leaving, Marcus knelt down and hugged his dog. "I'll be back after the clinic," he promised. Hope gave him a gentle lick on the cheek, something that had become their daily routine. At school, Marcus's first stop was the new student support office. This room, created as part of the Hope Initiative, had a food pantry, clean clothes, and school supplies for students in need. Marcus had helped design it, making sure it was a place where kids could get help without feeling embarrassed. "Morning, Marcus," called Mr. Thompson, the support coordinator. "Ready for your presentation today?" Marcus nodded. He would be speaking to the 6th grade classes about homelessness and kindness. It wasn't always easy to talk about his experiences, but he remembered what his grandmother had said. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to keep going. During lunch, Marcus sat with his friends in the cafeteria. Kevin, his best friend, was organizing a weekend volunteer day at the animal shelter. Other students were planning a food drive. It amazed Marcus how many kids wanted to help once they understood the problems some of their classmates faced. After school, at the veterinary clinic, Dr. Chen watched proudly as Marcus helped care for a scared kitten. His gentle touch and soft voice calmed the animal immediately. "You'd have a gift," she told him, just like she had that first morning when he saved Hope. That evening, walking home with Hope beside him, Marcus passed the alley where he had found his dog months ago. The city had placed a small sign there that read Hope's Corner, with information about the Hope Initiative and how to get help if needed. Back in their warm apartment, Marcus sat doing his homework while Hope dozed nearby. His grandmother was baking cookies in the kitchen, extras from the coffee shop that she would send to the school's food pantry tomorrow. Looking around at his new life, Marcus thought about how one small decision, to help an injured dog, had created such big changes. His grandmother was right. Sometimes the hardest times in life led to the most beautiful destinations. And even more importantly, he had learned that one person's kindness, no matter how small, could change not just one life, but many.